Hear my humble cry, while on others thou art smiling. Do not pass me by. Let me at a throne of mercy find a sweet relief, kneeling there in deep contrition. Help my unbelief.
Hello, everyone. This is Joseph Holbrook, professor of religious studies and Latin American studies and history at Florida International University. I've decided to try something new. I'm going to start giving book reviews of some of my favorite books that have made a formative impact on my own spiritual journey as well as intellectual journey. And so I'm going to begin today with a book I read a few years ago by David E. Fitch called The End of Evangelicalism. Bear with me one moment. That's not what I wanted. Let's try this again. Document and browse my computer. Let's go with this. I'm going to open an outline here of to help me organize my thoughts. So, David Fitch is a professor of evangelical theology at Northern Seminary in Chicago, the Chicago area. He's also a pastor of a church, the name of which I do not have in front of me, and he's a blogger. And so he has written a book called The End of Evangelicalism with a question mark. And what he does in this book is he uses Serbian philosopher Slavoj Žižek and his philosophical framework about ideology in order to analyze current evangelicalism. I don't recall at the moment what year the book was published, but I want to say around 2007, if I'm not mistaken. The problem with doing these recordings is it's hard to get everything up on my screen at once. My notes, my outline, and YouTube music, and the recording session. So I'll do the best I can. I have a written document about 8 pages long if you'd like to read it. My review and my thoughts on the subject. There's a bunch of reviews online as well. Let me know and I'll be happy to send it to you. So Žižek develops an elaborate theoretical framework to analyze ideologies. And Dave Fitch takes that framework and applies it to contemporary evangelicalism. Again, right around 2007, 2008, if I'm not mistaken. And couple of the things that Žižek says about ideologies, every ideology is formed out of a foundational trauma. One of the extreme examples of an ideology, of course, that we can think of immediately is fascism or Nazism. And it's easy to identify the foundational trauma for both Nazism and fascism was the tremendous violence and loss of life in World War I. Thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of young men went back to Germany and Italy, devastated by the Great War. So that's one example of an ideology and the foundational trauma that shapes it. The second thing is that every ideology is shaped in opposition to some external threat or enemy. This was super helpful for me when I realized it, because I was puzzled, I was bamboozled, perplexed by some incongruities that I was seeing within my own tradition of evangelicalism. And I couldn't figure out why. The research question I set out to solve back in the 1990s is, why is evangelicalism, well, originally it was, how can evangelicalism effectively present the gospel to secular people? And then later that may have morphed into, why is evangelicalism unable to present good news to secular people? And in the 90s, as I started into an academic process, and I became aware of the concept of ideology. And there's several different approaches that one can take to ideology, but one of them is the Marxist sense of ideology as mystification, or ideology as a false consciousness. Another way to look at ideology is the bed of Procrustes in the Greek myth. The Procrustean bed was a particular length, and Procrustes was very hospitable. He would welcome people into his home, invite them to stay in his guest room. They could sleep in the bed. There's one catch. If they were too tall, he would have to cut off part of their feet to make them fit the bed. If they're too short, he would have to stretch them until they were uncomfortable, to put it mildly, so that they would be able to fill the bed. And this is the kind of the sense I had of ideology. The ideology so easily becomes a one-size-fits-all. If you need to make a square peg fit in a round hole, you cut off the edges, so that ideology becomes an all-encompassing, proposed system of truth for government and economics and society. And so I was seeing within my own tradition some incongruities, as Thomas Kuhn would say, in the structure of scientific revolutions, contradictions. I was seeing things that just didn't add up to me, that didn't seem to square with the Sermon on the Mount about loving our enemies, praying for those who spitefully used us. Instead, I saw evangelicalism becoming or continuing to be very hostile and adversarial. One Bible teacher that I respected, and I still respect, said at one point in the 1990s that you cannot have influence with someone if you have an adversarial attitude towards them. And that became important to me. So I began to look into this idea of ideology and began to read everything I could get my hands on. I was working on developing my own definition of ideology, and as a means of distinguishing it from genuine Christian faith. Now that's problematic. As an academic, I've learned that everything has to be defined. And so how do you define genuine Christian faith? There are dozens, if not tens of dozens or hundreds of groups that claim to have a monopoly on genuine Christian faith. So I was doing this more as a personal exercise. I can't offer a definition of genuine Christian faith, but it's the kind of like obscenity in the Supreme Court. I believe I know it when I see it. That's very unsatisfactory for an academic. I understand that. So Fitch develops this book. He says that Žižek's political theory says that evangelicalism has increasingly become an empty politic. A politic defined by what or who we are against, as opposed to who or what we are for. That's the difference between an empty politic or a politic of fullness. And Fitch goes on to assert that he thinks evangelicalism behaves like an ideology that is unraveling. This brings him to a discussion of master signifiers. A master signifier is a symbol it's a master symbol of the ideology. Again, going back to our example of fascism or Nazism, it's very easy to identify master symbols. The swastika was a master symbol for the ideology of Nazism. Now, not all ideologies are that extreme or necessarily even bad. There can be an ideology of nationalism or patriotism for which we might say that the American flag or the Pledge of Allegiance are master signifiers. And if that's the case, that would explain why there was such a furious reaction against Colin Kaepernick and the other NFL players who bowed to their knees rather than stand during the Pledge of Allegiance. They were going up against a master signifier. One of the things about a master signifier is that it's abstract. It's not specific. It's ambiguous. So it can mean a lot of different things to different people. So that people who normally would be in conflict with one another can unify around a master signifier because it means something different to each group. So they're often very ambiguous, and they take on a reified reality of their own, an abstract reality without much specific content. And but they're very powerful signifiers of a particular or a group of ideologies. So, this in my own reading, I went back to, I believe it was the 1300s, Francis Bacon, and one of his essays, which I can't remember the name of at the moment, used the term idola, and it was the first time in intellectual history that the term ideology began to appear. An ideology comes from idola, which obviously for someone with a biblical perspective would remind you of idolatry or idols, idola. So ideas can take on a life of their own abstractly and become to some degree reified or even demonic, would be one way to put it, to make the point a little more forcefully. So that goes back to Francis Bacon. And I had done my reading from that point up to more modern approaches to ideology, such as Karl Mannheim, who did quite a bit on utopia and ideology before Fitch's book fell into my hands. So David Fitch shows that he believes that fundamentalism, out of which evangelicalism has grown, fundamentalism has its foundational trauma around 1910, in the 1910s, with the whole modernist controversy and eventually the Scopes monkey trial. And at some point, fundamentalism was traumatized by a sense of rejection by mainstream society. It withdrew into its own institutions and its own subculture. It also began to develop a fundamentalist ideology, and I'll say more about that in a moment. So that's the foundational trauma. The petit objet, or the external threat, of course, was the social gospel, or church Christian liberalism, mainstream Protestant churches, and a liberal point of view. That another enemy would be secular humanism in the 1960s, 70s, popularized by Francis Schaeffer. And so evangelical ideology had a traumatic beginning. It had an external threat, and it has master signifiers, according to David Fitch. The first master signifier is the inherent Bible. Now he outlines three of these. He makes it very clear as a professor of evangelical theology. He is committed to Orthodox Christianity. He is committed to the divine inspiration of the Bible. It is useful. It is divinely breathed useful for teaching, doctrine correction. But he's talking about these concepts as abstract concepts that become reified or take on a life of their own, empty of specific content, and that serve as unifiers for a diverse group of people who read different things into them. So the first one is the inerrant Bible, and he devotes, I believe it's chapter 3. The first chapter, he introduces the background to this and the current condition of evangelicalism in 2007. The second chapter, he introduces Slavoj Žižek's theoretical framework and philosophy about ideology. The third chapter, he examines the beliefs of the inerrant Bible, how that developed in the 19th century through the tools of modernism by people like Charles Hodge at Princeton Seminary. And he shows some of the logical and inherent contradictions that some Christian leaders will carry this idea of the inerrant Bible to. Christian Smith does a masterful job of also analyzing this specific chapter, not the chapter, but the concept. He calls it Biblicism. Biblicism, the Bible Made Impossible by Christian Smith, devotes a whole book to this topic of the inerrant Bible and modernist ways of interpreting the Bible as a empirical data source and a historical textbook. Then the second one is the decision for Christ. God has a wonderful plan for your life. Repeat this prayer and you will be saved and go to heaven. And he shows some of the extremes this went to in the 1980s and 90s, and he gives some examples of some of the negative consequences. And he is very clear that he believes in conversion. But this, again, this is an abstract symbol or empty a master signifier. And then the third one is the Christian nation, which I think is particularly poignant right now in our current political context, because nationalism has come to the fore, especially among many Christians. So you have the nationalists versus the globalists, and I'm not saying either one is particularly more Christian than the other, but there's a problem with, as many of my friends in the readers group will remember, we've gone through some studies of the Christian nation versus living at the margins of empire. And some other good books have come out just recently dealing with this issue of living like exiles as opposed to living like triumphant and dominant members of a Christian nation. It's a problematic idea. And this is one of the three master signifiers that he analyzes in chapter 5. Then he discusses this concept of the eruptions of the real. This is interesting. The eruptions of the real is based on, Slavoj Žižek basically says the only way you can expose an ideology is to ridicule it. Irony becomes very important in dealing with an ideology. And he gives a number of examples. One of the examples, I don't know how many of you saw Borat, but there's a scene from the movie with Borat. I don't remember the entire title of the movie. I don't particularly like Borat. But there's a scene where he goes to a Texas football stadium and he's dressed with a shirt with an American flag and a cowboy hat. He claims to be from Kazakhstan, and he gets the microphone somehow, and he begins telling the American people, the people gathered in that football stadium, what they want to hear about how great America is, how exceptional it is, and he's cheering, and they're all cheering him on. And this is actually was done during the Iraq War, build up in the invasion of Iraq. And he keeps exalting his comments and pushing it on steroids beyond the norm. He starts out saying, "Yay for America, we're going to have victory," and everybody's cheering. And pretty soon he says, "We hate those people in that country, and we want them dead, and we ought to go in there and kill them." And the people are still kind of cheering, but a few people are starting to hesitate, and he says, we need to go in there and kill them, man, woman, and child. And a few people are still cheering, but others are looking troubled and quizzically at him. And finally, he says, let's just go in and blow it up with nuclear weapons. And what he's doing there is he's pushing it beyond the envelope and revealing through irony the ideology behind it and making fun of it. That's also leads to a couple other concepts called le petit objet and jouissance in French. But another example of the eruption of the real that I thought of, and you may feel free to disagree with me. I'm not trying to bring politics into this, but to some degree it has to be. But in the elections in Georgia recently, Alabama, the Republican candidate who won the primary, Judge Roy Moore, had very credible accusations of child molestation against him, and yet he received I don't recall the exact number, but it was far beyond the majority. I'm thinking up in the 80s percentile of evangelical women voters, or at least evangelical voters. I hate to get into numbers because I'm probably going to be wrong on the specifics, but he was enthusiastically supported by evangelicals despite credible suspicions of child molestation. This is an eruption of the real. This is something that will make thoughtful Christians pause and scratch their heads and say, wait a minute, something here is not right. And we could also probably draw other examples. Now, I'm focusing on evangelicalism, so I'm not going to try to do a tit-for-tat liberal versus conservative fairness. I'm talking basically about the ideology that's embraced by the religious right. That's not to say there's not also a progressive ideology. There is. I'll probably get some pushback on somewhere in this video. The petit objet is the external threat. There's almost always a pariah people in which guilt is foisted off on those people, and they become a threat. And it helps pull together the people within the group and helps unify the people that surround that master signifier and identify with that ideology. With the Nazis, of course, it was the Jews. With other ideologies, you can identify other external threats. With the resurgence, the emergence of a evangelical or fundamentalist ideology, it would be liberal Christians or liberal Christianity, social gospel. It would be secular humanism, and I think we could also add a number of other groups to that list of enemies. And this, of course, then makes it impossible to follow out the Sermon on the Mount, to love your enemies, to pray for those who despitefully use you, to turn the cheek. All those things become complicated, impossible, when you're functioning on the basis of an ideology. So, jouissance is a secret joy evidenced by members of the ideology when there's eruptions of the real. So, I'm going to get myself in trouble here if I'm not careful about what examples I use. I'm not looking to polarize anyone in this discussion, but just give us some tools to be able to analyze why we've been feeling uncomfortable with current evangelicalism and its politicization or political stance. But I think perhaps maybe the example of Judge Roy Moore, some of the exuberant reactions to his winning the primary, some of the elaborate justifications of a man, a flawed man, because of the grace of God, because of forgiveness. Examples from the Old Testament of very flawed men who were used by God. That's what we mean by jouissance. Now let me jump over here to my notes for a second and wrap this up. So, getting down here to the conclusion, Fitch makes a great critique of current evangelical ideology. I think he convincingly proves that there is an ideology. He does not try to propose any alternatives other than he does propose a more central focus on Christ instead of what we're against, but what and who we're for. Perhaps he's trying to avoid falling into the trap that the Hunter points out in his book on cultural change, where Hunter critiques the left, right, and the Anabaptist options. Fitch does quote Brian McLaren. Brian McLaren is saying, even the religion we are committed to and in which we found God and purpose and meaning and truth can become the religious public relations department for an inadequate and a destructive ideology. So I think he was primarily in this book doing deconstruction. You might call it diagnosis. The doctor has to diagnose before he can prescribe medication. The book fell into my hands 2 or 3 years after I came up with my own, perhaps overly simplified definition of ideology. This has helped me discern the difference between ideology and faith. This is my definition. How can religious ideology be distinguished from religious faith? Ideology contains certainties. Faith contains mysteries. Ideology promotes militancy. Faith promotes humility. Ideology must be implemented with energetic human force. Faith rests in the providence of God. Ideology produces antagonism between opposing parties. Faith produces love for one's enemies that bridges oppositions. I came up with that in 2009. So if anyone has found themselves increasingly uncomfortable with some aspects of current conservative evangelical political involvement, but you don't know exactly why, I think a careful reading of David Fitch's book might be very enlightening, and I highly recommend it. That's all I have for today. I have a half a dozen books that have been formative and influential in helping me along my own journey, and I hope over the next year to write up a review and to put a review video on YouTube for each one of them. Thank you very much for your time and attention.